Oh, it was definitely the most marvellous ship. I knew her inside and out. Oh, she carried many of my best memories, too. I met Petrus on the port of Rotterdam in 1910. He was rushing about. I think he forgot to bring a gift for his mother. Well, his hat got knocked off and fell right into my hands. I gave it back to him and off he went, nodding a thank you to me. The next time I saw him was at the lounge. I was reaching into my bag and, in doing so, tipped my tea. The next thing I know, he was right there, wiping up my little mess. I tried to dismiss him, but he laughed and put himself in the chair facing mine. Pouring me a new cup, we introduced ourselves. I gave him my name and he reached into his coat, pulling out a book, my book. He looked right at me, smiled, and asked, "You wouldn't mind signing this, would you?" And the rest is history. Regardless, we had our wedding in 14 and had our honeymoon in Regina by the sea. We weren't actually planning on going to New York for another 2 weeks, but happened to cross paths with Isidore, Phoebe, and their lovely son Morgan during a morning stroll. We called them to join us, and soon enough they invited us on their trip. I had a strange feeling, for sure, but I assumed it was just that I was unsure about cutting my honeymoon short. But I did make up my mind, thinking that Petrus and I would simply enjoy the rest of our romantic adventure in New York. My brother, Leslie, was there and wanted to show us his new studio upon our arrival. We booked a room at the Waldorf Astoria. Oh, a great deal of our savings went to that. And off we went. Our bags were packed the next day and we left for Southampton the day after that. Boarding was just like usual. We were greeted by Officer Ishmael once we went up to the promenade. Oh, it's a shame he wasn't among the survivors. He was a bit timid and reserved in his mannerisms, but was extremely friendly nonetheless. He'd always ask me how my family was. I'd never had too much to say. He told me, "Your life is quite refreshing. What a blessing." I never knew what that meant. But it's too late to ask him now. Anyways, those 3 days weren't particularly notable, but yes, still enjoyable. Petrus and I must have played 100 rounds of chess to pass the time. Oh yes, chess. Somehow each round always ended in a draw. It was a very pleasant surprise when Mr. Webbage tapped Petrus's shoulder and sat down with us. He said to my husband, "All right, sport, swap seats with me and I'll show you how to really play. After this, checkmates will be as easy as waltzing." He was right. Not a single draw would happen after his intervention, but we were ever the more entranced by the game. Mr. Webbage appeared so benign. I never thought he'd be caught in that controversy after the wreck. Oh, but dinners were delicious. I remember that my last meal on board was beef bourguignon. I believe that the Clarent's menu had shifted towards French cuisine after 1912, since they hired a French chef, the same one who runs that excellent cafe in New York now. Tea time was marvellous too. Mrs. Brayley, Mrs. Rickard and I sat together. We'd chat about the regular business and such. Interestingly, during our last conversation, I remember telling Mrs. Rickard that my next novel would be published by the Bernauer Press. Her face lost all colour. She exclaimed, "Bernauer? Of all publishers, are you mad?" Startled, I replied, "Well, it's actually Bernard's wife, Mrs. Edith, who manages. Should we not support our fellow women?" Mrs. Rickard shook her head, continuing, "We should, but not her. She and Bernard are both rotten, I'll give you that." I didn't know what her problem was with the Bernauers, but it didn't seem like something appropriate to ask. After that, she excused herself, leaving Mrs. Brayley and I to converse. Mr. Brayley had found his way into conducting the band playing the entire time. Having written all the songs being played, he couldn't ignore the mistakes. While his wife and I discussed upcoming shows on Broadway, he was correcting the band's every little slip-up. Oh, one remark I've never forgotten was, "It's a violin, not a whimpering puppy." What a character. Now, as for the night of January 11, it was a bit of a blur, I'll admit, but I'll try and recall as much as I can. Petrus and I were awake quite late that night. around 11:30, I believe we were still on the sun deck. We were leaning over the railing a bit, enjoying the winter air on our faces. I was still a bit chilly, and he placed his coat on my shoulders. It wasn't the clearest night. I could have sworn it was nearly a full moon. A few stars here and there were hugged by some clouds, but it was beautiful, all of it. We enjoyed the silence until he turned over to me and handed me a box. He had forgotten to give it to me before the wedding, but even then I still didn't open it. I accepted it, yes, but wanted to wait until we arrived in New York, just so I wouldn't lose it. But I still haven't opened that box. I've been afraid to spoil the last surprise he's left for me. Well, around midnight, we found our way back inside, not realizing the time we went to the lounge. Usually the doors were closed by 11:30. We entered, but immediately felt quiet. That feeling of unease washed over us, like spotting a bear in the woods. There were two others in the lounge, right in the center, under the chandelier. Petrus and I peered around the bookshelf by the door and saw Officer Ishmael, as well as who I believe was one of the wireless boys. Both seemed distressed and broke out into an argument of sorts. Something like this. The wireless boy handed the officer a piece of paper, a telegram. Having read it, Ishmael inquired him, asking, "No, I don't think I can. Who sent this?" The boy replied, "Right, it was Mr. The officer placed his hands on the wireless operator's shoulders. He insisted, saying, "You must be mistaken. Yes, as you said, I'm very familiar with him. I know all of the regulars, in fact. I know him better than the rest, but his request, his note is unmistakably outrageous. He must be mad." That was the last I remember about that conversation. A steward approached me from behind and told my husband and I that we weren't supposed to be there. We obliged and we returned to our cabin. And maybe around 40 minutes later, we were stirred by another steward and told to head to the lifeboats. We didn't realize it since our room was on one of the top decks, but a fire had started near the rear third-class cabins. By the time we were situated on the top deck, the blaze's size must have doubled. It seemed to be Armageddon, hordes of passengers running about, falling over, tearing lifebelts from each other. Another officer drew out a pistol while an unruly bunch clambered into one of the lifeboats. In the few moments I took in the scene, I lost Petrus. Everyone looked the same that night. Faces blurred by the mark of death, and I couldn't discern my husband from anyone else. I was fortunate to be thrown into a lifeboat by Mr. Webbridge as he hurried in with who I believe was his maid. Next thing I know, I was about 200 feet from the ship, 200 feet from Petrus. Not only could I still hear the roar of the blaze, but so much more so the screaming. It was like witnessing Judgment Day, except that the innocent were too being cast into the lake of fire. Surrounding the horror were some other lifeboats. All I could think of was that there were just not enough for everyone. By far. And Mr. Seawright knew that. I saw him from a distance, sitting half dead in his lifeboat. Half of him was still on board with his wife, whom he was so cowardly to abandon, and the other half was with us, a pillar of regret. I considered him a friend, and by all means am still thankful for his invitation to join him and Phoebe. But, well, none of us really can excuse his negligence. I'm heartbroken. You'd think he'd known better. It's foolish and unthinkable to have such few lifeboats for so many passengers. But it's about the money. Luxury is pricey, and that price in this case was paid with over 1,000 lives. Some of those lives included the people I cared for the most. Mrs. Brayley, Mrs. Rickard, Petrus. All of the men, women, and children of all classes who died while Mr. Seawright fled into a lifeboat. I still mourn for them. Oh, when I think of Isidore's son, too. I don't know whatever became of him, but the loss of his mother must have been awful. Phoebe was a wonderful soul, but I'm not sure if I can say the same about her husband. From the example of Mr. Webbage and Mr. Seawright, I've learnt that one can be kind, but not necessarily good. But one thing's for certain. The press has insisted on that the tragedy was caused by a boiler explosion. Now I say it with complete confidence that there was not even a bang that night. I find that Mr. Seawright's faults only pertain to his cowardice and the morality of his escape. How poorly managed it all was. But he didn't cause the disaster like many claim. Self-sabotage is ridiculous. No, from what I remember very clearly about Officer Ishmael's conversation with the wireless boy, a fire doesn't just start so suddenly. It must have been an attack. I believe it had to have been orchestrated by...